In the late 1930s, the balance of power in the Pacific depended heavily on information that moved through radios and cables. Japan, already at war in China since 1937, pushed further into East and Southeast Asia, occupying French Indochina in 1940 to 1941 to secure resources, especially oil and rubber. The United States, which supplied a large share of Japan's imported fuel, responded with export controls and then with an oil embargo. Both governments understood that any future clash across the Pacific would be fought over long sea lanes, scattered island bases, and dispersed naval task forces that depended on fast, secure communications. By 1941, both sides had invested heavily in cryptography and radio intelligence. Japanese naval and diplomatic messages traveled in complex systems such as JN-25 and the PURPLE cipher, while American and British analysts in Hawaii, Washington, and other centers worked to recover codebooks and additive tables. Before and after the attack on Pearl Harbor, U.S. cryptanalysts gradually gained partial access to Japanese naval traffic, enough to influence operations like Coral Sea and Midway. At the same time, Japanese specialists broke or read portions of several Allied systems, intercepting movements, convoy plans, and some battlefield reports. This contest created a specific problem for the U.S. Marine Corps. Amphibious operations in the Pacific required rapid, flexible coordination between ships offshore and small scattered units on beaches and in jungle terrain. Standard U.S. codes and ciphers were comparatively slow when relayed through field codebooks or mechanical devices, and simpler field systems risked interception and decryption by Japanese listening posts. After-action reports from early campaigns emphasized that delays or misunderstandings in radio traffic could influence whether artillery, naval gunfire, or air support arrived at the intended place and time. For U.S. commanders, the ideal solution would combine three features: high speed, resistance to enemy code breaking, and portability down to company and platoon level. Existing cryptographic equipment met the first requirement only partially, and the third not at all. Against this background, some officers began to revisit an experiment from the previous World War: the use of indigenous languages as spoken codes on unsecured radio channels. During 1918, Choctaw, Cherokee, Comanche, and other native soldiers had transmitted tactical messages in their own languages on the Western Front, with little evidence that German intercept units understood them. The interwar period complicated that precedent. Reports circulated in U.S. military circles that German visitors, posing as scholars or anthropologists, had tried to study certain native languages between the wars, raising doubts about whether those tongues still offered true obscurity. Planners therefore sought a language that was both structurally complex and relatively undocumented in foreign academic circles. It was in this context that some Marine officers turned their attention to the Navajo people and their language, Diné Bizad. On the eve of American entry into the war, the Navajo Nation occupied a large reservation across parts of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. In 1940, contemporary estimates placed the Navajo population at roughly 48,000 to 50,000 people, making it one of the largest native nations in the United States. The reservation's economy centered on sheep herding, small-scale agriculture, wage work in nearby towns, and federal relief programs. Living standards varied, but many households lacked electricity, running water, or paved road access, and cash income was limited. Federal policies toward the Navajo and other native nations had shaped language and education in ways that would later intersect directly with military communications. From the late 19th century into the 1930s, government and mission boarding schools discouraged or punished the use of native languages, including Navajo, in favor of English-only instruction. Many Navajo children grew up balancing two linguistic worlds: English in institutions and Diné Bizad at home and in community life. As a result, by 1940 a large share of Navajo adults were bilingual, able to move between spoken English and a tonal, verb-centered indigenous language that had few published grammars and limited presence in non-native academic work. Within Navajo society, reactions to global events followed their own logic: the memory of the long walk, forced relocation in the 1860s, and subsequent dealings with federal agencies shaped attitudes toward U.S. authority. Yet in June 1940, the Navajo Tribal Council adopted a resolution stating that the 50,000 people we represent recognize the international crisis and declared support for the United States in the event of war, framing service as consistent with defending their homeland. For many Navajo families, enlistment offered wages, travel, and a way to participate in national defense. For others, it raised concerns about leaving the reservation or fighting under a government that still controlled much of their daily life. On the Japanese side of the Pacific, code-breaking and radio interception formed part of a broader strategy to compensate for material constraints. Japanese naval intelligence placed emphasis on traffic analysis, direction finding, and cryptanalysis to monitor U.S. fleet movements and convoy routes. Their specialists approached American and British communications with the expectation that any new system was potentially solvable through enough captured material, repeated phrases, and statistical analysis. From this viewpoint, a sudden appearance of radio traffic in an unfamiliar language would be treated first as a cipher to be studied, not as an insurmountable barrier. By December 1941, when Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor and the United States entered the war, these parallel developments had converged. The Pacific Ocean became both a physical and an information battlefield. U.S. leaders worried that compromised codes might expose future operations. Japanese intelligence officers, confident in their existing successes against several Allied systems, anticipated further opportunities as American forces expanded their radio networks. Between these two positions stood a comparatively small indigenous nation whose language, suppressed in classrooms yet maintained in homes and ceremonies, would soon be proposed as one solution to a technical military problem. From the perspective of Navajo communities, the coming war promised both disruption and new connections. Young men of enlistment age found themselves at the intersection of reservation life, federal military recruitment, and a global conflict that few had expected to reach their own sheep camps and chapter houses. For U.S. Marine planners, they represented a potential pool of bilingual recruits whose speech patterns might be adapted into a structured code. For Japanese intelligence officers, they were, at first, invisible, future voices on the radio, whose significance would only become clear when standard methods of cryptanalysis failed to produce results. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, recruitment offices began to extend deeper into rural and reservation areas. On the Navajo Nation, announcements reached trading posts, schools, and chapter houses by radio, posters, and word of mouth. Young Navajo men reported to induction centers in places such as Fort Wingate and Phoenix, where they underwent physical examinations, literacy tests, and background checks similar to those applied to other volunteers. Some arrived having worked in civilian jobs off the reservation. Others came directly from herding and farming. Their decisions reflected a mixture of economic need, local leadership resolutions, individual initiative, and the pressures of national mobilization. Within the U.S. Marine Corps, the specific idea of using Navajo speakers as a communications asset emerged in early 1942. A key intermediary was Philip Johnston, a World War I veteran and civil engineer who had grown up on the Navajo reservation as the son of missionaries and spoke Diné Bizaad. Familiar with the earlier use of native languages in Europe, he approached Marine officers in California with the proposal that Navajo speech might function as a tactical code over standard voice radio. His argument combined technical claims about the language's complexity with the practical availability of bilingual Navajo men willing to enlist. Marine headquarters authorized a small-scale demonstration. In February 1942, Johnston arranged for several Navajo speakers to visit Camp Elliott near San Diego. There, they participated in controlled tests. English messages were written down, translated into Navajo, transmitted over field radios, received by another Navajo speaker, and rendered back into English. Observing officers compared the time required and accuracy achieved against existing field cipher methods. Reports from the demonstration emphasized that unaided Navajo speech produced complete, comprehensible translations in less time than manual encryption and decryption, while remaining unintelligible to non-Navajo personnel nearby. Following these tests, the Marine Corps approved an initial experiment in the form of a dedicated Navajo communications unit. In the spring of 1942, recruiting efforts focused on identifying approximately 30 suitable Navajo candidates. Age limits, physical standards, and security concerns all applied. Prospective recruits needed enough English to follow orders and technical instruction, enough fluency in Navajo to handle rapid, precise speech, and the willingness to leave the reservation for training and possible deployment overseas. For some families, the request intersected with existing patterns of military service. For others, it meant sending a first son into an unfamiliar institution. Those selected traveled by bus and train to the Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego. There, they entered the same basic training system as other recruits: close order drill, rifle instruction on weapons such as the M1903 Springfield and the M1 Garand, physical conditioning, gas mask drills, and instruction in Marine Corps regulations. Drill instructors treated them as part of regular platoons, enforcing uniform standards and discipline. Language sometimes created misunderstandings, but bilingual Navajo recruits often helped interpret instructions informally. For others who were less confident in English, parallel to general recruit training, Marine communication specialists began to outline how Navajo speech would be integrated into existing radio procedures. Standard equipment such as the SCR 300 backpack set and SCR 536 handheld set required operators who could tune frequencies, maintain batteries, and follow radio discipline under fire. The plan was to train the Navajo recruits both as regular Marines and as radio operators, so they could serve at battalion and regimental level, relaying messages on beaches, in forward observation posts, and between infantry companies. From the Navajo perspective, the opening phase involved rapid exposure to new environments and hierarchies. Men who had grown up in dispersed hogans and small towns now lived in crowded barracks alongside recruits from cities across the United States. They encountered unfamiliar food, strict schedules, and an institution that had historically been part of the same federal system that oversaw Indian agencies and boarding schools. Some viewed the Marine Corps as a route to wages and technical skills, others as a way to demonstrate loyalty after decades of restrictive policies, and others simply as the primary available option in a wartime economy. On the Japanese side, these developments were invisible. Japanese naval and army signals units monitored Allied radio traffic in multiple theaters, cataloging frequencies and call signs, and attempting to identify new ciphers as they appeared. Early in 1942, their attention remained focused on established Allied systems associated with fleet movements and supply convoys. The voices of Navajo trainees at San Diego, practicing on training nets and field exercises, were just one more layer of American internal preparation that did not yet register as a distinct problem for enemy cryptanalysts. By the time the first group of Navajo trainees completed basic training and moved on to specialized communications instruction later in 1942, the experimental nature of their role was clear. Marine commanders expected them to function as regular riflemen when needed, but also as a potential solution to tactical communication delays experienced in earlier Pacific operations. Their presence represented the opening of a new, untested channel in the wider Pacific intelligence contest, one whose effectiveness would be measured not in laboratories but on islands that were still, at that point, only names on planning maps. Strategic planning for the Navajo Code program began once the first group of approximately 29 recruits completed basic training and assembled under Marine communications officers in 1942. The Marine Corps' objective was to produce a voice code system that allowed rapid transmission of standard military messages over unsecured radio circuits while remaining resistant to enemy cryptanalysis. This required more than simply speaking Navajo. It required formalizing vocabulary, standardizing procedures, and integrating the system into existing command and control structures. The program's designers divided their work into two main components. The first was a vocabulary list to express common military terms. Many modern concepts, such as battalion, machine gun, or fighter aircraft, had no direct equivalence in traditional Navajo. The Navajo recruits and their Marine supervisors resolved this by selecting descriptive Navajo words or combinations and assigning them fixed meanings. For example, a word meaning turtle could stand for a tank, while other animals or objects were linked to planes, ships, or rank titles. The second component was an alphabet system, in which Navajo words were assigned to each letter, allowing names, map coordinates, and other specific information to be spelled out when necessary. From the Marine perspective, the planning challenge was to balance simplicity for trained Navajo operators with opacity for anyone else. The final system thus layered complexity. A listener would first need to understand Navajo, and then understand that many of the terms carried code-specific meanings unrelated to their everyday sense. Written code books listing these associations were used only in training and then collected, reinforcing the principle that the system depended on memorization rather than physical documents that could be captured. Operationally, the Marine Corps planned to position Navajo Code Talkers at key nodes in the communications chain. At division, regiment, and battalion command posts, they would sit alongside radio operators using standard equipment. When a commander issued an instruction, a Navajo Code Talker would convert it into the agreed Navajo code, transmit it, and another Code Talker at the receiving end would render it back into English for the local staff. This arrangement was intended to shorten the interval between decision and execution compared to written ciphers, while preserving security. On the Navajo side, the planning process meant systematizing their own language in unfamiliar ways. Men who had grown up speaking Navajo in family and ceremonial contexts now participated in turning parts of that language into structured tools for a national military doctrine that had been developed without them. They contributed suggestions for terms, debated which images would be clearest, and practiced recalling long lists under time pressure. For some, this represented a form of participation in national defense. For others, it was a practical adaptation to their assigned role, carried out within the constraints of Marine discipline and schedules. Japanese strategic planning in signals intelligence proceeded on parallel but independent lines. Japanese naval and army staffs sought to preserve the security of their own codes while penetrating Allied systems as deeply as possible. Their objectives included identifying invasion plans, convoy routes, and reinforcement schedules across the Pacific. To achieve this, they allocated personnel to intercept stations on islands and in coastal areas, equipped them with receivers and recording devices, and trained them in traffic analysis and cryptanalysis. From their point of view, any new pattern of Allied radio traffic was a potential source of information if it could be cataloged, analyzed, and eventually read. Because the Navajo Code was planned as a spoken system, Japanese cryptanalytic assumptions did not initially account for its structure. Their methods were optimized for written messages that could be copied, grouped, and subjected to frequency counts and pattern searches. A stream of unfamiliar syllables, lacking obvious word boundaries or repetition of standard indicator groups, did not fit neatly into those methods. However, Japanese planners expected that, given enough time and material, any recurring system might yield a systematic study, especially if they could link intercepted messages to observed battlefield events. Within the broader U.S. command structure, the Navajo Code remained one component among many. Strategic planners in Washington and Pearl Harbor still relied on machines, code books, and high-level cryptanalytic work to secure communications between major headquarters. The Navajo system was designed primarily for tactical and operational levels in Marine formations. Its success or failure would therefore be measured against immediate battlefield criteria: speed, accuracy, and resistance to enemy exploitation in specific operations, rather than in overall theater-level intelligence assessments. By late 1942, the planning phase had produced a workable first version of the code, a trained initial group of Navajo Code Talkers, and a concept for their deployment in upcoming amphibious operations. The Marine Corps had set clear expectations. They were to function as ordinary Marines under fire, and, at the same time, as specialized communicators. Japanese intelligence planners remained unaware that a new human-based cryptographic system was being prepared within the American order of battle, while Navajo communities on the reservation understood mainly that their relatives were training somewhere near the Pacific coast for duties that combined radio work and frontline service. The first operational test of the Navajo Code came with the Guadalcanal campaign in the Solomon Islands. In August 1942, elements of the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and nearby islands to secure an airfield that could control sea lanes between the United States and Australia. Among the infantry, artillery, and engineer units were a small number of Navajo Code Talkers assigned to regiment and battalion command posts. Their task was to handle tactical messages on the same radios used by other Marines, but using the new code that had been rehearsed in California. On Guadalcanal, the terrain and conditions exposed the limitations of existing communications methods. Dense vegetation, heavy rain, and improvised positions made landlines difficult to maintain. Radio sets required constant battery management and careful placement to avoid interference. Under these conditions, any delay in relaying fire missions, situation reports, or requests for ammunition could affect how quickly supporting arms responded. The Navajo operators began sending short, standardized messages in their code for reports such as enemy sightings, changes in frontline positions, and coordination of artillery fire along the Lunga perimeter and other key sectors. From the perspective of Marine commanders on the island, the early engagements around the airfield, later named Henderson Field, provided a direct comparison between Code Talker traffic and other systems. When Japanese forces launched night attacks in August and September, regimental and battalion staffs used multiple channels simultaneously: runners, field telephones, and different radio nets. Reports from units that relied on conventional ciphers sometimes took longer to encode and decode. In contrast, Navajo messages could be spoken, received, and translated within minutes. Accuracy was assessed by comparing reports with subsequent reconnaissance and battle outcomes, reinforcing confidence in the new system. For the Navajo Marines themselves, these first engagements meant applying memorized code lists under stress. They had to listen to instructions in English, convert them into code, transmit over radios that might be exposed to shellfire or small arms, and then stay ready to receive replies. Their work rarely appeared in official communiques, which focused on infantry actions and air operations, but internal reports noted that code-based voice traffic functioned without documented compromise during the campaign. Within their own perspective, this period marked a shift from theoretical training to practical participation in a major Pacific operation. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal and in the wider theater used their own communications networks to direct attacks and request naval and air support. Japanese intercept units monitored Allied radio traffic from positions on nearby islands and from ships at sea, trying to separate routine chatter from messages linked to specific operations. English-language transmissions using standard Allied procedures could sometimes be categorized or partially understood. By contrast, when intercept operators encountered traffic in an unfamiliar language with no clear points of reference, it was typically logged and passed on without immediate analysis. During the early months on Guadalcanal, such traffic was a small portion of the total volume and did not yet trigger a concentrated cryptanalytic effort. Local civilians experienced these first engagements from another angle. Solomon Islanders near Guadalcanal saw both sides establishing bases, moving along coastal routes, and fighting over control of the airfield and surrounding ridges. For them, Allied and Japanese radio traffic alike took the form of distant voices from sets carried by patrols or installed in command huts. The content of Navajo-coded messages was inaccessible, but the visible results, shifts in artillery fire, aircraft sorties, and troop movements, were part of a broader pattern in which outside powers used the islands as a communications and logistics hub. As the campaign continued into late 1942 and early 1943, the initial success of the Navajo Code Talkers on Guadalcanal encouraged Marine planners to expand the program. Reports from division and regiment headquarters indicated that the system had supported engagements along the Matanikaw River, around Mount Austin, and during Japanese attempts to reinforce or evacuate their forces by sea. The Code Talkers became a standard feature of Marine radio nets in the Solomons, integrated into the routine of sending situation reports at set times and urgent messages during attacks or counterattacks. These experiences formed the foundation for their deployment in later operations across the Central and Western Pacific, where the scale of landings and the density of radio traffic would increase significantly. As the Pacific War expanded in 1943 to 1944, the demands on communications grew with each new landing. Operations in the Solomons, Gilberts, and Marshalls brought more Marine divisions into action, and with them more radios, more frequencies, and a higher volume of messages moving between ships, aircraft, and shore parties. The Navajo Code program responded by enlarging its training pipeline. From the original group, the number of code talkers increased into the hundreds, organized into teams assigned to each Marine division and many regiments and battalions. Their tasks became part of the standard planning documents for amphibious assaults. The escalation in scale created new pressures. During the assault on Betio Island in the Tarawa Atoll in November 1943, for example, radio nets were crowded as landing waves approached coral reefs. Landing craft grounded or were destroyed, and units tried to report their positions under fire. Code talkers on shore and on control ships transmitted updates on landing progress, enemy strong points, and requests for supporting fire. In practice, they shifted rapidly between routine reports and emergency calls, maintaining the code structure while coping with noise, damaged equipment, and abrupt changes in command as officers were wounded or killed. On Bougainville, New Britain, and later in the Marshall Islands, the pattern repeated in different terrain. Jungle canopy, mountains, and scattered strong points made visual contact unreliable, increasing reliance on radio. Code talkers relayed information on patrol routes, artillery adjustments, and coordination with airstrikes. The crisis moments arose not only from enemy action, but also from miscommunication risks within Allied forces. When multiple units operated on adjacent frequencies, maintaining discipline in call signs and procedures became essential. Any error in the coded Navajo vocabulary could send ordnance to the wrong grid square or delay reinforcement at a critical sector. Japanese forces also entered a phase of crisis and adaptation. As Allied offensives advanced through the Solomons and into the Central Pacific, Japanese garrisons experienced isolation, shortages of supplies, and pressure from combined air and naval operations. Their signals units tried to maintain links between island outposts and higher headquarters, while monitoring Allied traffic to anticipate landings and air raids. When intercept operators encountered unfamiliar Allied voice transmissions, these were noted but competed for attention with large volumes of English language and conventional coded traffic. Japanese analysts faced a choice between concentrating scarce resources on systems that showed signs of partial solution and those, like Navajo coded messages, that yielded no obvious patterns. For the Navajo Code Talkers, escalation meant longer deployments, higher operational tempo, and increased exposure to battlefield hazards. They carried rifles and sometimes operated close to the front line, where radio operators could best observe and report changes in enemy positions. In some cases, their appearance and language created confusion among other American troops, unfamiliar with native peoples from the Southwest, leading to incidents in which code talkers were questioned or briefly detained until their role was confirmed. To reduce these risks, some units assigned them bodyguards or issued special identification instructions to nearby formations. On the home front, Navajo communities followed the war through letters, occasional visits from men on leave, and radio news in English. They were aware that relatives were serving in the Marines, often in communications roles, but the details of the code remained restricted. Casualty notifications, when they arrived, were similar to those received by non-native families. Brief official statements about deaths or injuries on distant islands, whose names were unfamiliar to most people on the reservation. The broader crisis of wartime mobilization intersected with local concerns over grazing rights, education, and federal policies that continued independently of the conflict overseas. Within the U.S. command structure, reports from successive campaigns emphasized both the utility and the vulnerabilities of the Navajo system. It was effective when at least 2 trained code talkers could be kept on each critical net, but shortages of personnel or illness could create gaps. The memorized vocabulary had to be expanded as operations introduced new equipment types, call signs, and place names. Maintaining consistency across dozens of dispersed teams required periodic refresher training and updates, even as units rotated between combat and rest areas. By mid-1944, the accumulation of amphibious operations had turned the Navajo Code from an experiment into a routine component of marine tactical communications, but the environment remained characterized by crisis conditions. Each new landing, from the Marshalls to the Marianas, brought heavy opposition and complex coordination problems. In that context, the Code Talkers' work formed one strand in a larger network of measures designed to preserve secure, rapid communication at a time when both sides faced mounting casualties, logistical strain, and the challenge of adjusting doctrine to a war that had become more intense and geographically far-reaching with each passing month. By mid-1944, the Pacific War reached a phase in which large-scale amphibious assaults and sustained land battles coincided with an expanding long-range air offensive. In the Central Pacific, the Marianas Campaign, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam became a central objective because airfields there could support B-29 bombers against the Japanese home islands. U.S. planners committed tens of thousands of Marines and soldiers, supported by carrier task forces and heavy naval gunfire, to dislodge Japanese garrisons entrenched in caves, bunkers, and urban areas. Within this framework, Navajo Code Talkers were distributed across Marine divisions as standard components of regimental and battalion communications sections. On Saipan in June 1944, U.S. forces landed with roughly 70,000 troops over the course of the operation, facing a Japanese garrison on the order of 30,000 Army and Navy personnel. The island's mixed terrain, beaches, cane fields, villages, and rocky high ground required constant coordination between infantry companies, artillery batteries, and naval gunfire support. Navajo Code Talkers on the beaches and later inland transmitted messages on enemy counterattacks, shifts in front lines, and adjustments of supporting fires. At this peak of the campaign, the volume of messages increased. Pre-planned fire missions, emergency calls during Japanese night attacks, and reports on ammunition and casualty levels all passed through radio nets, where Code Talkers worked alongside English-language operators and liaison officers. Japanese commanders on Saipan attempted to maintain communications through buried cables, runners, and radio sets placed in protected positions. Naval and Army staff still relied on conventional codes and ciphers for higher-level traffic, while frontline units used simpler field codes and plain language when necessary. Japanese signals personnel continued monitoring Allied transmissions, looking for patterns that might reveal intentions. In the dense radio environment around Saipan, most attention focused on traffic that appeared to be in English. Unfamiliar voice transmissions, such as Navajo-coded messages, did not fit established templates and were typically classified as unidentified, one element among many at a time when Japanese staffs were under pressure from air attack, artillery, and ground offensives. Civilian populations in the Marianas experienced this peak phase through displacement and direct exposure to combat. On Saipan and Guam, local Chamorro, Carolinian, and Japanese settler communities were caught between defending and attacking forces. Orders transmitted over secure marine nets, directing artillery to specific ridges or calling for advances into built-up areas, translated into movements that affected civilian shelters, crops, and infrastructure. From a local viewpoint, the technical distinction between Navajo-coded and other American radio traffic was invisible. What mattered were the resulting changes in control of villages, access to food, and risks of being mistaken for combatants. The recapture of Guam in July-August 1944 added further evidence of how the code functioned during high-intensity operations. Marine divisions advancing inland from the beaches relied on multiple overlapping nets to link company commanders with artillery observers and naval gunfire control parties. Navajo Code Talkers passed information on Japanese positions in jungle-covered hills and coordinated supporting fires with ships offshore. At the same time, Guamanian civilians, many of whom had lived under Japanese rule since 1941, provided guides, intelligence, and labor to American units. For them, the restoration of U.S. administration was experienced alongside the destruction of homes and fields caused by both sides' artillery and airstrikes, whose timing and targets were shaped by secure communications. In early 1945, the battle for Iwo Jima represented another concentration of forces and communications demands. Approximately 70,000 Marines from the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions landed against a defending force of more than 20,000 Japanese troops. The small land area, extensive tunnel networks, and absence of a large civilian population made the island primarily a military environment, focused on control of airfields and high ground. During the first days of the landing, Marine headquarters recorded hundreds of messages sent by Navajo Code Talkers concerning unit locations, requests for tank support, and corrections to artillery and naval gunfire. The ability to send these messages rapidly without pausing for manual encryption was regarded by commanders as essential to maintaining coherence amid severe losses and frequent changes in local leadership. Japanese defense on Iwo Jima relied heavily on pre-war tunneling and carefully prepared firing positions. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi's staff used underground command posts linked by telephone cables and limited radio traffic to delay detection. Once American forces were ashore in strength, bombardment and movement gradually disrupted Japanese internal communications. Attempts to monitor Allied radio transmissions continued, but in this concentrated environment, the practical priority for Japanese units shifted toward conserving ammunition and deciding when to launch local counterattacks, rather than extensive cryptanalytic work. From their perspective, the decisive factors were artillery density, air control, and the depth of their own fortifications, not detailed understanding of every Allied voice transmission. The Okinawa campaign, beginning in April 1945, expanded the scale even further. U.S. 10th Army deployed roughly 180,000 soldiers and Marines in the ground assault, while the Japanese 32nd Army fielded around 90,000 to 100,000 troops, supplemented by local auxiliaries. The island's significant civilian population, estimated in the hundreds of thousands, lived in villages, towns, and agricultural areas that became battlegrounds. Marine divisions on the western and southern sectors again used Navajo Code Talkers in their communications networks, handling reports from company and battalion command posts as lines shifted under prolonged combat and severe weather. For Okinawan civilians, the peak of the campaign brought displacement into caves, shelters, and designated zones behind Japanese lines or within American-controlled areas. Radio messages transmitted in English, Japanese, or Navajo influenced artillery barrages, naval bombardments, and movements of front lines, but were not accessible in content. The result was experienced instead through changing patterns of control, evacuation orders, and the destruction of homes and infrastructure across the island. In this period, the Navajo Code formed part of a larger system that allowed American formations to operate with relatively secure tactical communications, while Japanese units faced increasing difficulties in linking dispersed positions to higher command, as casualties and material shortages accumulated. As the war continued into late 1944 and 1945, the Navajo Code system itself underwent a form of resistance and adaptation. The original vocabulary of just over 200 terms was expanded to cover new types of weapons, aircraft, ships, and unit designations, introduced as the U.S. military structure in the Pacific grew more complex. Additional word lists and alphabet equivalents were added, bringing the total code vocabulary into the hundreds. Code talkers in training were expected to memorize these enlarging sets under time limits, while instructors checked for consistency to prevent gradual drift in usage across different units. On the ground, adaptation took practical forms. Experience on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, the Marianas, and Iwo Jima led Marine communications officers to develop standardized message formats, brief, formulaic sentences that could be rendered quickly into Navajo code, transmitted, and then converted back into English without confusion. Code talkers incorporated grid references, time markers, and unit call signs into fixed positions in these formats. This reduced the chance that stress, noise, or fatigue would produce ambiguous phrasing. The system remained flexible enough to spell out unusual names or targets letter by letter when necessary, but routine information moved increasingly through prearranged patterns. Japanese signals organizations also adapted to a changing environment. As Allied operations advanced, Japanese intercept units relocated, consolidated, or shifted focus from long-range monitoring to more localized tactical support. Analysts cataloged Allied call signs, frequencies, and apparent net structures. When they encountered repeated streams of unfamiliar speech, they could identify them as a distinctive category of traffic associated with marine formations. Post-war interrogations and reports indicate that Japanese cryptanalysts recognized this as a problem, but concentrated their limited resources on systems they believed more likely to yield results, such as conventional Allied ciphers and operational codes used for logistics and fleet movements. The Navajo-based system thus persisted partly because it did not fit existing analytical tools, and partly because other targets appeared more promising. Within the Marine Corps, resistance to technical and doctrinal rigidity also appeared. Some commanders initially questioned the practicality of relying on a small number of specialists who spoke a language unfamiliar to the rest of the unit. After multiple campaigns, operational reports citing rapid, accurate message handling helped shift attitudes. Training directives gradually formalized the requirement that each battalion and regiment have a certain number of code talkers, and that they be integrated early into planning for upcoming operations instead of being attached at the last minute. This institutional adaptation gave the program a more stable footing, even though it remained numerically small compared to the overall strength of Marine formations. For the Navajo Marines, adaptation occurred at several levels at once. They resisted the erosion of their language by using it in a new, technically demanding context, while simultaneously adapting it to military needs that had not existed in traditional life. They moved between languages as part of their daily routine, receiving orders in English, translating into the agreed Navajo code, transmitting, and then converting replies back into English. Outside of operations, they navigated barracks life, relations with non-Navajo Marines, and the expectations of officers who often knew little about the reservation or its history. Some encountered stereotypes or misunderstandings. Others formed working relationships based primarily on technical competence and shared risk. Japanese radio operators and analysts confronted their own forms of psychological and organizational pressure. As Allied forces drew closer to the home islands, they faced rising message volumes, damage to their own communications infrastructure, and the knowledge that some Allied systems remained unreadable. The existence of an unbroken Allied voice code contributed to a broader sense that the balance in signals intelligence was shifting. In response, Japanese staffs emphasized operational security measures such as radio silence, the use of landlines where possible, and the construction of underground command posts to preserve local control even when higher-level communications were interrupted. Civilians across the Pacific adapted to a war in which invisible radio exchanges shaped visible events. In places like the Marianas and Okinawa, inhabitants learned through experience that particular patterns of bombardment or movement might follow exchanges between forward observers and ships offshore. Some communities adjusted their shelter locations or routines in response to these patterns, even though they had no access to the content of the messages. Their resistance took the form of survival strategies, seeking food, protecting families, negotiating with whichever force controlled their area, within a system whose communications architecture remained largely inaccessible to them. By the final year of the war, the Navajo Code Talkers and their Japanese counterparts in signals intelligence had each adapted to a prolonged contest whose technical and human dimensions had changed since 1942. The Code Talkers had moved from experimental status to established roles in multiple divisions. Japanese analysts had adjusted their priorities under the pressure of material shortages and territorial contraction. Both sides operated within organizations that tried to resist strategic decline or operational disruption through adjustments in doctrine, training, and equipment. Against this backdrop, a code built on an indigenous language continued to function as one piece of a wider communications network that linked decisions on ships and in command posts to actions on beaches, ridgelines, and in populated areas across the Pacific. By 1945, the cumulative effect of Pacific operations produced a turning point not only in territorial control, but also in the role of secure communications. Successive campaigns had demonstrated that American forces could project power across long distances while maintaining reliable command links between fleets, air groups, and ground units. Within this structure, the Navajo Code formed a small but consistent element at the tactical level. Internal Marine evaluations concluded that the system had operated throughout multiple campaigns without verified compromise, and that it had contributed to reducing delays in fire support and maneuver orders at regimental and battalion echelons. The turning point in the signals contest came less from a single dramatic event than from converging trends. On the American side, experience with island campaigns led to more integrated planning for communications. Prearranged radio nets, rehearsed procedures for amphibious waves, and standardized message formats that incorporated Navajo-coded traffic where Marine units were involved. On the Japanese side, attrition in shipping and fuel limited the deployment and maintenance of intercept stations, while air and naval losses reduced the number of platforms available for large-scale monitoring. Even where Japanese intercept units remained active, they faced a mix of high-level Allied ciphers, tactical codes, and unfamiliar spoken systems like Navajo that exceeded their analytic capacity. For the Code Talkers, this turning point appeared in routine operational changes rather than formal announcements. By late 1944 and early 1945, newly arrived Navajo Marines were joining units where earlier groups had already established procedures. Instead of functioning as a novelty, they entered radio sections where officers expected to have at least 2 code talkers available on important nets. Field exercises before landings on islands such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa treated Navajo-coded messages as standard practice. The shift from experimental use to doctrinal acceptance had largely taken place, even though it was not widely known outside Marine communication circles. Within Navajo communities on the reservation, the same period brought a different kind of turning point. Reports of major operations in the Marianas, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa reached the reservation through English-language broadcasts and newspapers, which rarely mentioned the specific role of Navajo Code Talkers because the program remained classified. Families knew that relatives were serving with Marine divisions and that some were involved in radio work, but the scale of their participation and the technical details of the code were not public. The turning point for them was the realization that the war might be nearing an end, signaled by news of American advances toward the Japanese home islands and heavy bombing raids conducted by B-29s from Pacific bases, whose capture had involved their relatives' units. In Japanese headquarters, the same developments were interpreted through a different lens. Staff officers noted the loss of outlying island garrisons, the destruction of major surface combatants, and the increasing density of Allied air raids. Communication summaries recorded difficulties in maintaining contact with isolated units and in protecting their own codes against Allied cryptanalysis, which by then was affecting convoys, reinforcements, and strategic planning. In this context, the existence of an unbroken American tactical voice code based on an indigenous language represented one of several areas where Japanese signals intelligence could no longer match Allied capabilities. The turning point for them lay in recognizing that the balance of cryptographic advantage had shifted decisively and could not be restored with available resources. Civilians in the wider Pacific region experienced the same transition as a change in patterns of movement and violence. On islands where fighting had already occurred, they observed the construction of permanent Allied bases, the regularity of supply convoys, and the sustained tempo of air operations. These outcomes depended partly on communication systems that functioned across thousands of kilometers, linking tactical radio nets, some of them carrying Navajo-coded messages, to theater headquarters and logistical commands. For civilians, the turning point took the form of a growing sense that one side had established the capacity to move and coordinate forces almost without interruption, while the other side's presence was shrinking to fewer locations. Within the U.S. military, the recognition that the war's outcome in the Pacific was moving toward a conclusion coincided with decisions about the future of communication systems, including the Navajo Code. planning staffs working on post-war structures considered which wartime innovations should be retained, modified, or replaced by peacetime cryptographic equipment and procedures. The Code Talker program, built around a particular language community and tailored to marine amphibious operations, was evaluated as effective in its specific context, but closely tied to the conditions of this war. This assessment would influence decisions made in the final months of 1945 and the immediate post-war period, when questions of demobilization, secrecy, and future doctrine came to the forefront as combat operations drew to a close. With the surrender of Japan in August 1945, combat operations in the Pacific ended, but the structures built around wartime communications did not disappear immediately. Marine divisions that had employed Navajo Code Talkers on islands from the Solomons to Okinawa shifted to occupation duties, repatriation of prisoners of war, and preparation for demobilization. The Code Talkers continued to operate radios in some units during the transition, relaying routine traffic in English or maintaining readiness while plans for possible further contingencies were still under review. At the same time, staff work for the canceled invasions of Kyushu and Honshu, which had included provisions for Code Talkers and assault divisions, was set aside. Japanese forces experienced the end of combat through a mixture of centralized orders and local decisions. In many places, commanders received surrender instructions via radio or courier, and then passed them to subordinate units still holding caves, bunkers, or dispersed positions. Signals officers destroyed codebooks, ciphers, and some radio equipment to comply with instructions, or to prevent use in the event of confusion. On islands where communications had already been heavily disrupted, individual groups of Japanese soldiers surrendered to nearby Allied units, or remained in hiding until contacted months or years later. For intercept and cryptanalytic units, the end of hostilities meant an abrupt shift from monitoring Allied traffic to compiling reports on their wartime work for occupation authorities. Civilians on islands that had been major battlefields faced immediate post-combat consequences. On Saipan, Guam, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the cessation of fighting allowed the establishment of distribution systems for food, medical care, and shelter under Allied administration. But these efforts took place in landscapes marked by destroyed homes, fields, and infrastructure. Communications networks that had once carried fire missions and maneuver orders now transmitted administrative instructions, requests for engineering support, and coordination with relief agencies. The technical continuity masked a change in purpose. The same radios and many of the same operators linked commands responsible for military operations to those responsible for reconstruction and repatriation. For the Navajo Code Talkers, withdrawal from combat took the form of staged returns. Some remained overseas for months on occupation duty in Japan or on former Japanese-held islands, performing guard, patrol, and communications tasks. Others were rotated back to the United States and processed through demobilization centers alongside non-Navajo Marines, receiving discharges and eligibility for benefits such as the GI Bill. Their role in the Code program, however, remained classified. They were instructed not to discuss details of the Code or their specific communications work, even with family members, because the Marine Corps and other agencies considered the possibility that the system might be reused in future conflicts. Within Navajo communities, returning veterans re-entered a society that had itself been altered by wartime conditions. Some families had experienced increased wage work in nearby towns or on military projects. Others had coped with the absence of multiple relatives at once. Veterans brought back savings, uniforms, and experiences of life in other regions and countries, but they often found that local issues such as grazing regulations, education policy, and federal administration of the reservation continued much as before. Community discussions of the war focused on service, casualties, and general impressions of distant places, while the specific nature of the Code Talkers' work stayed largely unspoken due to security rules. Japanese veterans of signals and cryptanalytic units went through their own demobilization process. Many were interrogated by Allied intelligence teams, interested in understanding which Allied systems had been broken, how they had been analyzed, and where Japanese efforts had focused. These interviews contributed to post-war assessments of the effectiveness of various codes, including the conclusion that the Navajo-based Marine Tactical Voice Code had not been solved during the war. Former Japanese signals personnel then returned to civilian life in a country undergoing occupation, economic disruption, and the early stages of political reform. Across the Pacific, the end of organized combat did not immediately resolve humanitarian questions. Displaced civilians sought to return to or rebuild homes near former front lines. Repatriated prisoners of war and conscript laborers traveled by ship and rail to their home regions, and local authorities worked with Allied administrations to re-establish civil services. Communications networks played a central role in coordinating these efforts, but their functioning now depended more on conventional English and Japanese traffic than on the specialized codes developed for amphibious operations. Within the U.S. military establishment, the immediate post-war period involved inventorying wartime innovations and deciding which to retain. The Navajo Code Talker program, assessed as effective in its specific context, was not expanded into a general model for all services. Instead, attention shifted toward mechanical and electronic cryptographic devices suitable for global peacetime and early Cold War communications. The Code Talkers' contribution remained in classified reports and internal evaluations, while the men themselves dispersed into civilian occupations, further education, or continued service, carrying with them experiences that, for the moment, could not be fully incorporated into public narratives of the Pacific War. In the decades after 1945, the place of the Navajo Code Talkers in the history of the Pacific War evolved through changing institutional, national, and community perspectives. Initially, their work remained largely absent from public accounts. Official histories emphasized major battles, high-level cryptanalytic successes against Japanese systems, and technological developments in radar and aviation. The tactical voice code built on Navajo was referenced in classified reports, but its details were restricted because military planners considered the possibility of renewed use in future conflicts. As a result, the roughly 400 Navajo men who had served as code talkers returned to civilian life with limited external acknowledgement of the specific nature of their contribution. Within Navajo society, the legacy took a different form. Families and local communities recognized returning veterans as participants in a global war whose main theaters lay far from the reservation. Their service joined earlier experiences of Navajo scouts in the 19th century and enlistments in World War I, forming part of a longer history of interaction with U.S. military institutions. At the same time, broader issues such as land use, resource extraction, education policy, and political representation continued to shape daily life. The Code Talkers' role in safeguarding communications remained mostly an internal matter, discussed cautiously because of continuing secrecy rules. In Japan, post-war reflection on signals intelligence focused on why Allied cryptanalysis had achieved significant successes, while Japanese efforts had not matched them. Studies by former officers and later scholars examined organizational structures, training, and resource allocation. They noted that some Allied systems, including the Navajo-based Marine Voice Code, had remained unbroken. For Japanese veterans of intercept and cryptanalytic units, this confirmed wartime impressions that certain categories of Allied traffic were inaccessible with the methods and manpower available. Their accounts placed the Navajo Code within a wider pattern in which material shortages, institutional priorities, and late recognition of certain problems limited the effectiveness of Japanese signals intelligence. As Cold War conditions developed, U.S. cryptographic practice shifted decisively toward machine-based and later electronic systems designed to secure communications across alliances such as NATO and within a global network of bases, embassies, and commands. In this environment, a language-specific tactical code tied to one indigenous community no longer fit strategic requirements. The Navajo system was not expanded to other languages on a large scale, and new equipment gradually replaced the field radios and procedures of the 1940s. This did not diminish assessments of the wartime program's effectiveness in its own context, but it meant that its direct technical legacy within military doctrine was limited. Public recognition began to change after the code's details were declassified in the late 1960s. Veterans, journalists, and historians started to document the structure of the vocabulary, the training process, and the Code Talkers' deployment in specific battles. This generated a new narrative strand in accounts of the Pacific War. Alongside discussions of carrier task forces, submarine campaigns, and strategic bombing, there appeared stories of indigenous language-based communication systems. For a wider American audience, the existence of the Navajo Code Talkers highlighted both the practical use of native languages in national defense and the earlier policies that had discouraged those languages in schools. From a historiographical standpoint, the Code Talkers' story intersected with broader debates about indigenous participation in modern wars. Researchers examined enlistment rates from reservations, the impact of military service on later educational and employment opportunities, and the ways in which veterans navigated both tribal and federal structures. The Navajo case provided a detailed example of how a community's linguistic and cultural resources could be integrated into a state's military apparatus under conditions of global conflict, while raising questions about sovereignty, representation, and long-term political relationships. Japanese and American scholars studying signals intelligence placed the Navajo Code within comparative frameworks. They analyzed why machine ciphers, manual codes, and language-based systems had different vulnerabilities, and how organizational choices influenced outcomes. In these analyses, Navajo Code Talkers appeared as one part of a multi-layered allied communications environment, effective at the tactical level and secure in practice because it combined human memory, linguistic complexity, and restricted dissemination. In later decades, formal recognition took institutional shape. U.S. presidents and Congress issued proclamations and awarded medals to surviving Code Talkers and, posthumously, to those who had died. These ceremonies framed the program in terms of national appreciation for military service, while Navajo officials and families integrated them into ongoing efforts to secure resources and recognition for the reservation. Commemorations on the Navajo Nation, including memorials and educational programs, presented the Code Talkers as part of a wider narrative of resilience, adaptation, and participation in world events. Civilians in former Pacific battlegrounds encountered this legacy through museums, memorials, and historical tourism. Exhibitions at sites on Saipan, Guam, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa sometimes included references to allied communication systems, including the Navajo Code, as part of explanations of how operations had been coordinated. For local populations whose wartime experience had centered on bombardment, occupation, displacement, and reconstruction, these narratives added a technical dimension to the history of battles that had reshaped their islands. Taken together, the long-term significance of the Navajo Code Talkers can be described along several axes. Militarily, their work demonstrated that a carefully organized, language-based voice code could operate securely and efficiently in high-intensity amphibious warfare. Politically and culturally, the program illustrated how an indigenous language that federal policy had once sought to suppress could become an asset in a national conflict, influencing later discussions about language preservation and education. In the field of intelligence history, the fact that Japanese cryptanalytic units did not break the code became one data point in assessing the relative strengths and limitations of both sides' signals organizations. For the individuals involved, the legacy combined technical achievement, service under fire, and the long-term effects of military experience on personal and community trajectories. For the U.S. military, it became a case study in the integration of specific cultural and linguistic knowledge into operational practice. For Japanese veterans and analysts, it formed part of the record of challenges they had faced in attempting to keep pace with Allied cryptographic measures. For civilians across the Pacific, it remained one component of a conflict whose outcomes were visible in changed borders, altered economies, and the presence of military installations long after 1945. In this way, the history of the Navajo Code Talkers links local language use on the reservation, tactical decisions on distant beaches and ridgelines, and post-war debates about memory and recognition. Their contribution did not determine the overall course of the Pacific War, but it shaped how certain operations were conducted and how secure communications were maintained under specific conditions. The continuing study and commemoration of their work reflect an effort to integrate these tactical, cultural, and technological dimensions into a more complete understanding of how the war was organized, fought, and remembered on all sides.